Millions of ordinary citizens upheld a regime that led them to total destruction. It was not only the fanatics or the SS. Teachers, workers and housewives kept the system running until the very last day. Even with Berlin in ruins and the army collapsing, the majority of the population continued to obey orders without questioning them. Nazi machinery not only used terror, but also absolute social integration. The fear of the Gestapo mixed with patriotic loyalty and community pressure. Reporting a neighbor became a civic duty, and doubting the leader became treason. The state eliminated any political or moral alternative, leaving the population without tools for organized resistance. Why did ordinary Germans continue to fight when defeat was obvious? What prevented early surrender or internal collapse? How does total destruction occur without rebellion? The armistice that did not bring peace, when defeat became humiliation. On the 11th of November 1918, at 11 o'clock, the Western Front ceased fire. The armistice was signed in a railroad carriage in the Compiègne forest and immediately ended military operations, but it did not restore political continuity within Germany. The imperial power dissolved within days. Wilhelm II abdicated, the central authority changed form, and in several cities, councils of workers and soldiers emerged that assumed public order functions, while the administration attempted to maintain basic services in a country exhausted by the blockade, shortages, and industrial reconversion. The signature linked to the new Republican government, with Matthias Erzberger among the representatives, was associated from the beginning with a discussion about legitimacy in conditions of institutional collapse. The silence of the weapons did not eliminate the urgency of distributing food, allocating fuel, regulating rail traffic, and preventing armed clashes in streets where authority was no longer univocal. The demobilization was massive and disorderly. More than 6 million men were supposed to return to an economy unable to absorb them stably, with factories changing their production, companies closing, transportation under logistical strain, and cities lacking sufficient housing. The uniform ceased to be a symbol of power and became part of a landscape of precariousness in stations, squares, and employment offices. The state had to register soldiers, manage discharges, injuries, and pensions, in addition to withdrawing arms and maintaining a reduced military structure, all amid disputes over who commanded in each district. For many veterans, the return did not reconstruct life prior to 1914. They encountered occupied jobs, displaced families, neighborhoods with new political organizations, in addition to a currency that was beginning to lose its capacity to set expectations. The society that had mobilized for the war did not automatically recompose. It was reorganizing with visible tensions. In 1919, political violence became a constant background. In Berlin, the Spartacist uprising in January demonstrated the fragility of government control, with strikes and confrontations in an environment where the police were insufficient or divided. The social democratic government of Friedrich Ebert resorted to the Freikorps, paramilitary units formed by veterans, to regain ground. That decision addressed an immediate emergency, but introduced a structural problem. The state depended on armed forces that did not always respond to stable institutional discipline. The repression had a deadly toll, in addition to the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht on the 15th of January 1919, an event that reinforced the idea that physical elimination could replace legal procedures. The Republic asserted itself through coercion exercised by actors who often despised the parliamentary system they claimed to protect. Instability spread to other regions. In Bavaria, the proclamation of the Soviet Republic in Munich in April 1919 confirmed that central authority could be suspended. The response was swift. Armed forces and paramilitaries retook the city in May, with executions and detentions leaving a prolonged administrative mark on courts and prisons. The problem was not limited to the duration of an insurrectional episode. It was the operational precedent. Each intervention reinforced armed networks that acted autonomously and consolidated a pattern. Politics was resolved in the street before stabilizing in parliament. Daily life continued amidst registrations, temporary closures, improvised patrols, and rumors of new uprisings, with businesses trying to open and families trying to maintain routines in neighborhoods where authority could change in a matter of hours. In that same year, the international framework set conditions that domestic policy could not evade. On the 28th of June 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. The text reorganized borders, limited military capabilities, and established economic obligations. The territorial losses were concrete and administratively immediate. Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France, Posen and parts of West Prussia passed to Poland. The Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of the country. Danzig became a free city. The Saar was placed under international administration, in addition to the loss of the colonies. These changes altered civil records, trade routes, judicial jurisdictions, and ownership of public goods. For those living in affected areas, it was not an abstract matter. It involved new controls, new authorities, new customs regulations, and decisions regarding residency and citizenship. The military clauses reduced the German armed apparatus to a legal minimum. The army was limited to 100,000 men, and key modern warfare instruments, such as military aviation, tanks, and submarines, were prohibited, while the navy was drastically reduced. Rhineland was demilitarized and remained under Allied occupation in defined areas, which affected the relationship between industry, transportation, and security in the West. Central structures were also dissolved, including the General Staff, with the closure of institutions, truncated careers, and a forced reorganization of the officer corps. The impact was visible in empty barracks, closed academies, and professional networks conflicting with a new framework that restricted recruitment and promotion. For the government, compliance was a condition of diplomatic survival. For nationalist sectors, it was a symbol of subjugation. Article 231 became the most repeated political axis of the treaty, by establishing the responsibility of Germany and its allies. For the damages of the war, it served as the legal basis for reparations. Reparations were not just a figure, they involved transfers of value that affected the real economy, deliveries of coal, industrial goods, and payments in foreign currency. Each international negotiation translated into domestic effects on production, rail transport, and budgets. The internal reaction was broad. From various ideological positions, the treaty was described as a diktat. That word circulated in speeches, press, and parliamentary debates, becoming a summary of grievances. The discussion was not exhausted because there was no simple solution. Accepting meant maintaining the state under unpopular restrictions. Rejecting implied the risk of sanctions or new occupations. Between 1919 and 1921, violence continued to function as a political tool. There were murders, attacks, and organized clashes. The state attempted to consolidate its legality, but inherited a judicial system from the empire, with continuity of personnel and institutional culture. That continuity reflected in unequal responses. Crimes linked to the left tended to receive harsher sentences, while right-wing violence often received leniency or limited punishments. It was not a theoretical discussion about jurisprudence. It affected public trust that the new regime could apply norms uniformly. In that context, the murder of Matthias Erzberger in August of 1921 by nationalist militants turned a figure of the Armistice into a political target and showed that the signature of 1918 continued to be a marker of guilt for sectors seeking internal culprits. The accumulated tension erupted explicitly on the 13th of March 1920 with the Kapp Putsch. Walter von Lüttwitz, a general of the Reichswehr in Berlin, refused to disband units of Freikorps, particularly the Erhard Brigade, and allowed their march on the capital. The entry of armed forces into Berlin without effective opposition exposed a command failure. When President Ebert requested the intervention of the regular army, the refusal, formulated in terms of solidarity among troops, indicated that the Republic could not automatically count on armed obedience in the face of a coup from the right. The government abandoned Berlin and operated from other cities, while Wolfgang Kapp proclaimed himself Chancellor, During those days, the country was not divided by a great battle. It was paralyzed by a dispute over authority. The coup failed due to the general strike. The collapse of transport, communications and administration emptied the government coup orders of content. Without officials to execute decrees, without printing presses to guarantee the circulation of instructions, without railways to move people and merchandise, the occupation of buildings was not enough to govern. Kapp fled, and the Republic returned to Berlin. But the institutional learning was uncomfortable. It became clear that the state could sustain itself thanks to social cooperation, while a part of its armed apparatus remained ambiguous in the face of the threat from nationalist sectors. This ambiguity had immediate consequences in the Ruhr, where armed workers during the strike refused to quickly surrender weapons. The response was repression with a high number of deaths, as well as arrests and raids. The Republic was re-established, punishing harshly those who had contributed to stopping the coup, a contrast that fueled distrust and resentment. In 1921 and 1922, reparations dominated the political agenda as a problem without a stable resolution. Conferences, ultimatums, and discussions about deadlines followed one another without offering a definitive closure. The issue of coal became especially sensitive because it connected external obligations with internal supply. Each delivery affected chains of production and heating, as well as state revenues. The government argued material limitations, but the Allies pressed with the possibility of coercive measures to ensure compliance. The result was a climate of blockage, cabinets changing, parliamentary debates returning to the same point, statements announcing partial agreements that were later reopened. Internal politics was trapped between the need to avoid a greater diplomatic crisis and the inability to present those concessions as acceptable to an already polarized public opinion. In this context, the currency began to lose stability in a noticeable way, without having yet reached a total collapse. Prices were rising, wages were trying to keep up with a delay, the value of the mark was eroding. Normal trade still existed, and banks, contracts and leases were still functioning, but predictability was deteriorating. The administration resorted to monetary issuance to cover expenses, including obligations arising from the conflict, and this issuance fueled new pressures. Daily life incorporated permanent adjustments, renegotiations, advance payments, disputes over rates. What was decisive was not an isolated statistic, but the practical feeling that money was beginning to serve less as a common measure. Between the Armistice and 1922, Germany did not regain a shared framework that aligned institutions, laws, and expectations. The defeat resulted in a treaty with territorial, military, and economic consequences. The Republic defended itself in an environment of violence that reinforced parallel armed actors. The judicial system did not offer a uniform response that would consolidate trust. The debate over reparations kept an international conflict open that returned to every internal decision. In that scenario, the state existed, but its ability to consistently impose authority was limited, and social cohesion depended on fragile balances. When the currency stops functioning as a reference accepted by all, the crisis ceases to be concentrated in statements and conferences and begins to settle in daily transactions. The collapse of money, the Ruhr under foreign control. On the 11th of January 1923, French and Belgian troops crossed the German border and entered the Ruhr, the industrial basin that concentrated a decisive part of the country's coal and steel. The occupation was the culmination of an administrative conflict over reparations. On the 26th of December 1922, the Reparations Commission declared Germany at fault for failures and delays, especially in coal deliveries. For the French government of Raymond Poincaré, the discussion about deadlines had ceased to be useful. If resources did not arrive, they would be taken at the place of origin. The deployment sought to control mines, workshops, railways and management offices, with checkpoints and garrisons that ensured extraction and transport under Allied supervision. Great Britain criticized the measure without preventing it. Italy remained distant, and the United States followed the process with concern about the European financial impact. In the Ruhr, there was no conventional military campaign. The occupying units advanced on infrastructures, secured railway hubs, established de facto authorities, and demanded technical cooperation. The occupation disrupted daily administration, permits, safe conducts, inspections, requisitions, fines. The tension did not depend on large battles, but rather on the constant friction between a regional economy under external control and a population that saw this presence as a direct intervention in their working lives. At the same time, the occupation affected all of Germany because the Ruhr was a center of energy, raw materials, and transport. Any interruption, even partial, was transmitted to factories far away, inland ports, and coal networks for urban heating. The conflict ceased to be a diplomatic file and became a set of visible controls at stations, warehouses, and roads. The German government responded with passive resistance. Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno asked workers and officials not to cooperate with the occupying authorities. In practice, the instruction meant strikes, refusal to operate trains intended for cargo controlled by France, business closures to avoid production under Allied supervision, as well as bureaucratic disobedience that hindered the processing of orders or facilitated inventories. The decision aimed to avoid an open military clash, but turned the economy into a field of pressure. The state promised to pay salaries to those who stopped working, compensate companies for losses, and sustain the pressure for as long as necessary. Passive resistance was based on a simple idea. If the Ruhr did not produce under occupying control, the occupation would be costly and politically unsustainable. The problem was financial. In 1923, the Treasury could not indefinitely support a paralyzed industrial region, nor cover subsidies without equivalent revenues. The practical solution was to increase the money supply. The Reichsbank printed marks at an increasing rate to pay payrolls, compensations, current expenses, and accumulated obligations. Inflation had already existed since the post-war period, but the shock of the Ruhr, combined with financing through emission, accelerated the process to the point of destroying the basic function of money. The exchange rates, followed by the press and merchants, illustrated this break. At the beginning of 1923, $1 was around 18,000 marks. In June, close to 110,000. In August, millions. In the fall, the scale ceased to be intuitive. In November, the exchange rate reached approximately 4.2 trillion marks for $1. At that point, the number did not describe wealth, but a unit that had lost meaning. Everyday life adapted as emergency logistics. Salaries were paid more frequently because purchasing power was evaporating within hours. Companies that were still operating tried to settle wages in the morning so that staff could buy before the next adjustment. Businesses changed prices several times a day, not due to isolated speculation, but because replenishing goods required paying more in the afternoon than in the morning. Urban transport, mail, and municipal services saw their rates multiply at a pace that forced them to constantly print new notices. In markets and bakeries, bills were stacked in increasingly impractical bundles. Counting them one by one was slow, and the weight of the paper became an operational data point. Currency ceased to be a stable medium of exchange and became an immediate bridge to physical goods. The most enduring blow fell on savings and fixed incomes. Bank deposits accumulated over years were reduced to amounts incapable of purchasing basic products. Government bonds, insurance, pensions, and long-term contracts lost their utility because they were denominated in a unit that was disintegrating. Part of the urban middle class, which organized its stability in accounts, conservative securities, or public salaries, saw that support disappear without a real protection mechanism. At the same time, those with debts were able to settle them with depreciated currency, while those who owned tangible assets, land, real estate, or goods, maintained relative value. This asymmetry reorganized social relations without the need for speeches. It was enough to observe who could continue buying coal, food, or clothing, and who had to sell items to obtain foreign currency or goods. As the framework lost credibility, alternative forms of exchange reappeared. Bartering spread in small transactions, and some professionals accepted payments in products due to a lack of a reliable monetary reference. Municipalities and businesses issued Notgeld, local emergency money, backed by assets or by the trust of a specific community. This money did not solve the national problem, but it facilitated purchases in limited scopes and allowed a factory to pay its staff with an instrument that local commerce accepted. Monetary fragmentation displayed a technical fact. The state's unit of account no longer unified the market. Economic cohesion, which relies on comparable prices and lasting contracts, broke down into thousands of small decisions made to survive, week by week. Meanwhile, the passive resistance in the Ruhr was accumulating political and human costs. The occupation responded with arrests, fines, expulsions, and coercive measures to ensure transport and production. There were clashes between soldiers and civilians, with deaths in isolated incidents, as well as a climate of permanent surveillance. France attempted to bring in workers to replace part of the German workforce, but the industrial scale made any complete replacement difficult, and sabotage, or simple inefficiency, continued to affect the results. The occupation also did not produce the expected revenues in a linear manner. Maintaining troops, administration, and logistics consumed resources, in addition to straining the diplomatic climate. In Great Britain and the United States, criticism grew due to the risk of destabilizing the European financial system. Germany, despite its internal crisis, gained leeway as an object of international sympathy in the face of a measure perceived as coercive. In August 1923, the Kuno government fell, and Gustav Stresemann took office as Chancellor on the 13th of August. His immediate priority was to stop the economic bleeding. On the 26th of September, he announced the end of passive resistance in the Ruhr, accepting that the state could no longer continue to finance the paralysis. The decision did not immediately repair the damage, but it allowed efforts to concentrate on stabilizing the currency. On the 15th of November 1923, the Rentenmark was introduced, backed by mortgages on land and industrial properties, with a drastic conversion that eliminated the old mark from practical circulation. The measure worked because it offered a tangible anchor, and above all, because the administration supported it with fiscal and monetary discipline. The interruption of inflation was swift, and the country began to operate with prices that could be maintained for more than a few hours. In that same climate of crisis, Adolf Hitler tried to turn the collapse into a political coup. On the night of the 8th of November 1923, he burst into the Bürgerbräukeler brewery in Munich with men from the SA, interrupted an event with Gustav von Kahr, and proclaimed the beginning of a national revolution, intending to march on Berlin. The operation failed the following day. On the 9th of November, the march was stopped by the police. There was a brief shooting. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers died, Hermann Göring was injured, and the uprising was dismantled. Hitler was arrested a few days later. The trial began in the February of 1924, and the public coverage allowed him to spread his program in a courtroom that gave him the opportunity to speak. The sentence was 5 years, but he served around 9 months in Landsberg, where he drafted part of Mein Kampf. The stabilization was not sustained solely by the new currency. In 1924, the Dawes Plan restructured reparation payments and facilitated loans, largely with American mediation and capital, to support recovery. The withdrawal of French and Belgian forces from the Ruhr was gradual, and the complete evacuation culminated in August 1925. For German social experience, however, the decisive year had already been established. In 1923, an industrial occupation, a resistance financed by issuance, and a currency that disintegrated in weeks taught that the everyday could break without warning, even when institutions continued to exist on paper. After 1923, that idea became ingrained, and in 1929 it broke again. Mass unemployment and political blockade, the crisis that transforms the vote. Between 1924 and 1929, Germany operated again with a fragile normality, supported by external credit, especially from the United States. The loans allowed for the refinancing of debts, the sustaining of investments, the reactivation of banks, and the keeping afloat of companies that needed constant liquidity. Industrial production grew to exceed pre-war levels in 1927, and in many cities, this was noticed in recovered shifts, resumed public works, and trade with predictable rhythms. Unemployment declined, although it did not disappear, and the improvement depended on a financial circuit that was not controlled from Berlin. The country seemed to have found a way to function, but that way rested on the continuity of a flow of capital that could be interrupted without warning. The stabilization also had a diplomatic aspect. Gustav Stresemann, as foreign minister, promoted a strategy of international reintegration that culminated in Germany's entry into the League of Nations in 1926. Reparations continued to exist, but under the Dawes Plan they were presented as a manageable schedule while the economy grew. The withdrawal of troops from the Ruhr removed a symbol of direct coercion and reduced immediate tensions with France. In that context, the political extremes seemed contained. The NSDAP existed, but did not dominate the electoral landscape. In the elections of 1928, it obtained less than 3% of the votes and 12 seats out of 577. For a large part of the political system, it was a marginal actor that depended more on agitation than on a real capacity to form a government. The turnaround occurred in the autumn of 1929. Stresemann died on the 3rd of October in 1929, and weeks later, the stock market crash in New York, with the panic of the 24th of October and the fall of the 29th of October, abruptly changed credit conditions. American banks halted new loans, demanded repayments on already granted credits, and reduced exposure in Europe. Germany, whose recovery was partly supported by short-term external financing, was exposed. Companies that depended on refinancing lost access to operational money. German banks, which had lent against external capital, faced a lack of liquidity. Industrial production began to contract because it was more difficult to purchase raw materials, maintain inventories, or cover payrolls in sectors without reserves. The problem was not just a fall in international prices, but the interruption of a mechanism that allowed for sustaining everyday activity. Between 1930 and 1932, the contraction resulted in large-scale closures and layoffs. Unemployment, measured in official records, rose rapidly, around 1,300,000 in 1929, close to 3 million in 1930, approximately 4,400,000 in 1931, and over 6 million in 1932. The unemployment rate moved from figures close to 4% in 1929 to levels around 30% in 1932, with even worse values in industrial cities. To those figures were added reduced working hours and underemployment, as well as those who stopped registering due to a lack of expectations. Unemployment insurance and municipal assistance were not designed for a crisis of that magnitude. Funds were exhausted, benefits were cut and shortened, and municipalities faced deficits while relief expenses increased. The crisis became visible in evictions, pensions, and overcrowded shelters, queues in front of soup kitchens, and a growing use of private aid networks that could not replace the state. The urban middle class was also exposed, this time by the simultaneous fall of consumption and credit. Small businesses closed because sales collapsed, professionals lost clients, workshops reduced activity. Indebted farmers were left without margin when agricultural prices fell and installments remained. Officials saw salary cuts and loss of purchasing power in a context of budget austerity. In 1931, the banking crisis worsened the feeling of insecurity. Temporary closures, restrictions, and losses for depositors showed that even the protection of savings was uncertain. The economic fabric retreated towards defensive decisions, such as selling assets, postponing payments, limiting purchases to what was essential, and seeking goods that retained value. The recovery of the mid-20s, sustained by credit, left a fragile structure in the face of capital withdrawal. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning responded with deflationary policies, cuts in public spending, reduction of salaries, increases in taxes, and contraction of social benefits. The logic was to maintain financial credibility, avoid a greater capital flight, and demonstrate to international creditors that Germany was applying discipline, in addition to reinforcing the argument that reparations were practically unpayable. In the short term, this strategy deepened the decline. Lower state spending reduced domestic demand. Lower demand aggravated closures and layoffs. More layoffs reduced consumption and revenue, which in turn intensified the pressure to cut. The economy entered a downward dynamic, and politics became trapped between unpopular measures and insufficient results. At the same time, the parliamentary system lost the ability to build stable majorities. The Reichstag fragmented, moderate parties weakened, and the government increasingly resorted to presidential decrees. President Paul von Hindenburg frequently activated Article 48 of the Constitution, which allowed for emergency measures, normalizing a mode of governance that circumvented lasting parliamentary agreements. This recourse did not eliminate conflict, it displaced it to the relationship between the presidency, cabinets, and a parliament that could be dissolved. The street acted as an indicator of polarization. The Nazi SA and organizations linked to the KPD featured clashes, interruptions of events, and confrontations with the police in several cities. The paramilitary presence was not a decorative detail, but a form of pressure that turned politics into control of spaces, times, and neighborhoods. In that context, the NSDAP went from marginal to a decisive force. In the elections of the 14th of September in 1930, it obtained 18.3% of the votes and 107 seats. The jump altered the balance of the Reichstag and turned the party into a central actor without the need for an absolute majority. The KPD also grew and reached 13.1% with 77 seats, reinforcing the inability to form stable coalitions. Nazi propaganda connected unemployment with Versailles and with the Weimar governments, promising work, discipline, and a review of the international framework, in addition to presenting the parliament as a symbol of paralysis. The party combined mass acts with an effective territorial organization, and the presence of the SA reinforced its visibility on the street. In a scenario where the state seemed to be reduced to cuts and decrees, the message of quick decision found space in diverse sectors of the electorate. The year 1932 concentrated elections and blockades. In the presidential elections, Hitler competed against Hindenburg. In the first round, on the 13th of March in 1932, Hindenburg received 49.6% and Hitler 30.1%, with Ernst Thälmann at 13.2%. As an absolute majority was not reached, the second round was held on the 10th of April in 1932, with Hindenburg winning with 53%, compared to Hitler's 36.8%. Shortly after, the parliamentary elections on the 31st of July in 1932 gave the NSDAP 37.3% and 230 seats, its best result, enough to be the largest party in the Reichstag, but insufficient for a stable majority. Hitler demanded the chancellorship. Hindenburg refused at that moment. Franz von Papen governed without a solid parliamentary base and resorted to new dissolutions. In the elections on the 6th of November in 1932, the NSDAP fell to 33.1% with 196 seats, while the KPD rose to 16.9%. The arithmetic remained blocked. The centre could not form a majority without forces that rejected the system, and the extremes did not cooperate with each other. In December 1932, Kurt von Schleicher replaced Papen and attempted to build a majority by dividing the Nazi camp through partial agreements. The maneuver failed. Papen, seeking to return to power, negotiated with conservative sectors a different plan: to integrate Hitler into a cabinet where the Nazis would be a minority and the key ministries would remain in the hands of traditional conservatives. The premise was that Nazi popularity could be used to stabilize the government without relinquishing real control of the state. With that calculation, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. It was an administrative act within the constitutional framework, the result of elections without stable majorities, governments by decree, and agreements among elites that assumed containment power. The point was no longer just to reach the government, but the speed with which, in that environment of normalized emergency, the state could become a deadlock mechanism, decrees that become routine, dictatorship as a way of life. On the night of the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building burned in Berlin when Adolf Hitler had been Chancellor for less than 1 month. The fire immediately became a political instrument. The official version attributed the event to a communist conspiracy and allowed the situation to be presented as a national emergency. The detention of a suspect at the scene was sufficient to activate a mechanism that did not rely on a long investigation, but on an executive decision. In practice, what was decisive was the state's reaction and the speed with which a physical, visible episode in the center of the capital translated into orders for arrest, searches, and information control. On the 28th of February in 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg signed the emergency decree associated with the fire. That text suspended basic civil guarantees. It limited freedom of expression and press, restricted meetings, weakened the inviolability of the home, and allowed detentions without ordinary judicial controls. The measure created an operational framework to act against political opponents under the appearance of legality, because it shifted the exception to a permanent level. From that moment, the police and auxiliary forces could operate with an expanded margin, with immediate consequences in raids, closures of establishments, seizure of propaganda materials, and preventive detentions. The elections of the 5th of March 1933 were held in that context. The campaign was marked by censorship, administrative pressure, street violence, and the detention of communist and social democratic militants. Even so, the NSDAP did not obtain an absolute majority. It reached 43.9% and needed allies to govern formally. The fact was relevant because it shows that institutional transformation did not depend on a total electoral triumph, but rather on a combined use of state resources, coercion, and subsequent legal reforms. With the parliament under pressure, the priority shifted to changing the rules so that the lack of a majority would no longer matter. On the 23rd of March in 1933, the Reichstag voted for the Enabling Act, officially presented as a legislative solution for the affliction of the people and the Reich. The regulation allowed the government to enact laws without parliamentary approval and to pass measures that could contradict the constitution. The environment was not neutral. Armed forces surrounded the building, and the atmosphere of intimidation accompanied the session. Approval required a qualified majority, and it was obtained thanks to the support of conservative parties and the Catholic Zentrum, which negotiated guarantees regarding religious institutions. Only the Social Democrats voted against it. With that law, the parliament ceased to be the center of decision-making, and the legislative power became absorbed by the cabinet, which turned the legal procedure into the main avenue for the demolition of the system. Starting in 1933, the regime implemented the Gleichschaltung, the coordination of institutions and associations, to align them with the Nazi state. On the 2nd of May in 1933, the trade unions were dissolved, their leaders arrested, and their assets confiscated. In their place, the German Labour Front was created, controlled by the party, which replaced collective bargaining with supervised labour discipline. In July of 1933, the country became a single-party state, with the prohibition or dissolution of rival political organisations. Federalism was emptied through the imposition of Reich authorities in the states, subordinating regional administrations to Berlin. The coordination was not a symbolic gesture. It meant control of appointments, budgets, professional associations, clubs, leisure organizations, and structures that articulated social life. Public function became a point of early intervention. On the 7th of April, 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service allowed the expulsion of officials considered unreliable and excluded Jews from many state jobs. This purge affected teachers, judges, prosecutors, university professors, and administrative staff, altering institutional continuity from within. Universities and educational centres were subjected to ideological control through curriculum changes, pressure on teachers, and student reorganisation. On the 10th of May 1933, public book burnings in several cities showed a method of cultural signalling. Works by Jewish, Marxist or liberal authors were removed from libraries and destroyed in acts that conveyed a message of aesthetic and intellectual obedience. The propaganda was structured as state policy. Joseph Goebbels directed the Ministry of Propaganda and used radio, press and film to produce unified messages, in addition to imposing censorship and self-censorship. Newspapers were shut down or absorbed, editors replaced, and radio became a central means of dissemination, favoured by cheap receivers. The visual saturation in public space, with flags, posters and parades, was not just ornamentation, it established a constant presence of the regime in urban routine. The party congresses in Nuremberg were consolidated as an organised demonstration of strength, with choreographies, music, uniforms and speeches designed to showcase cohesion. Internal control was also expressed in selective violence. Since 1933, concentration camps were opened for political prisoners, with Dachau as an early example, initially intended for communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and other opponents. The function was administrative and coercive: detention without ordinary procedure, isolation, punishment, deterrence. The Gestapo and other police structures expanded capacities through networks of information, denunciations and surveillance, which reduced the need for a massive presence of agents in every place. Repression became a predictable component. It was not necessary for it to affect everyone at once to condition behaviours, because it was enough for it to be credible. The consolidation of the regime included a decisive internal purge. On the 30th of June 1934, the Night of the Long Knives eliminated figures from the SA and other adversaries, rearranging the hierarchy of the Nazi movement and sending a message of discipline through force. On the 2nd of August 1934, following the death of Hindenburg, Hitler merged the roles of President and Chancellor, concentrating state authority in his person and demanding oaths of loyalty. With this move, the structure of power ceased to depend on Republican balances and was reorganized around a unique leadership. Anti-Jewish exclusion advanced from harassment measures to legal definition. There were boycotts and economic pressures from 1933, along with expulsions from professions and increasing restrictions. In September of 1935, the Nuremberg laws established legal categories based on ancestry, stripped Jews of citizenship, and prohibited marriages and relationships with Aryans, according to the regime's terminology. Discrimination became codified, facilitating its administrative application in records, work permits, education, and access to public spaces. Between 1936 and 1938, the pressure intensified with new ordinances, expropriations, and systematic marginalization. On the 9th and 10th of November of 1938, Kristallnacht marked a leap into open and coordinated violence. Synagogues burned, businesses destroyed, mass detentions, and an unmistakable signal that the state tolerated and organized the attack. For broad sectors not directly persecuted, everyday life combined relative material stability with a loss of political freedom. Unemployment fell sharply between 1933 and 1938, driven by public works, labour service, rearmament, and the expansion of state-linked industries. The recovery had concrete mechanisms, spending financed with debt, public contracts, and planning. Hjalmar Schacht contributed to financing schemes like MEFO promissory notes, which enabled deferred payments for rearmament without fully reflecting them as immediate expenditure. This expansion did not imply a uniform improvement in wages or labour rights. Strikes were prohibited, collective bargaining was replaced by structures of the German labour front, and labour mobility was restricted through assignments and controls. The promise of employment served as an argument for social legitimacy in a country that was coming from years of mass unemployment. Social life was absorbed by organizations of the regime. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls expanded to become dominant frameworks of youth socialization, with sports activities, group discipline, and indoctrination. The pressure did not rely solely on laws, but on educational and labor advantages linked to membership, in addition to stigmas against families that resisted. Churches maintained complex relationships with the regime. The Concordat with the Vatican in July 1933 sought to protect Catholic institutions in exchange for non-political intervention, but tensions arose due to interference in youth associations and harassment of critical clergy. In the Protestant sphere, collaborationist sectors and currents of ecclesiastical resistance coexisted, with conflicts over doctrinal autonomy and state control. In foreign policy, the dictatorship accumulated facts that reinforced its internal position. Germany left the League of Nations in October of 1933. In March of 1935, it reintroduced compulsory military service, openly violating Versailles. On the 7th of March in 1936, it remilitarized the Rhineland, sending troops to a demilitarized zone, and the lack of immediate military response from France and Great Britain consolidated the perception of success. In March of 1938, the Anschluss incorporated Austria into the Reich, integrating its administration, resources, and workforce. In September of 1938, the Munich Agreements handed over the Sudetenland to Germany without a fight, weakening Czechoslovakia and showing that diplomatic pressure accompanied by military threat could produce concessions. These steps were not isolated episodes. They were integrated into a state narrative of power restoration that coexisted with internal repression. By the end of 1938, the dictatorship had already become administrative routine. Parliament had been emptied, rival parties eliminated, unions dissolved, the press subdued, justice conditioned, associative life coordinated, and the police apparatus enabled to act without ordinary controls. The economy operated under planning aimed at rearmament, with employment serving as a social stabilizer, while racial exclusion advanced as public policy with legal basis and organized violence. With internal control secured, war allowed for financing support and silences on a new scale. Prosperity through theft. The war that fuels the home. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and opened the European phase of the war. On the 3rd of September, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. Within the Reich, the immediate change was administrative. On the 15th of September, food rationing was introduced with coupons that set quantities per week. The system did not start as a hunger economy, but as a control method to avoid panic, hoarding, and sharp price increases. German agriculture, combined with stocks and with logistics still intact, allowed for regular supply to be maintained in cities. Lines existed, supply tightened, but the administration could distribute bread, fats, meat and sugar with sufficient continuity to sustain a wartime routine without a total breakdown of the household table. The campaign against Poland ended in weeks, and the Wehrmacht showed effective coordination between armoured units, infantry and aviation. Then came the period called Phony War, between October of 1939 and April of 1940, without major offensives on the Western Front. This interval reinforced a sense of functional continuity in Germany. Factories were working, wages were coming in, urban transport continued, cinemas and theatres opened, propaganda occupied radio and press with a narrative of control. The war was presented as an effort that could be maintained with discipline, not as an emergency that would force an immediate dismantling of civil life. The offensive of the 10th of May 1940 changed the map in 6 weeks. The Netherlands and Belgium were traversed, the Allied device was surrounded, Paris fell on the 14th of June, and the Armistice with France was signed on the 22nd of June. For the regime, the victory had enormous internal value, because it turned the memory of 1918 into a useful contrast. The Nazi state appeared capable of imposing quick results where the Republic had been associated with negotiation and obligation. The practical consequence was even more important than the symbol. With France occupied, Germany gained direct access to resources, industrial capacity, and a financing mechanism that shifted costs outside its borders. The occupation was organized as a systematic transfer of value. France had to pay occupation costs in amounts set by the German authority, in addition to accepting requisitions of agricultural products, raw materials, and manufactured goods. The French railway and industrial park were subordinated to German needs, and a significant portion of traffic was directed towards shipments to the Reich. At the same time, the German administration imposed price controls, quotas, and production priorities that turned occupied companies into appendices of the war effort. This pattern was repeated, with variations in Belgium and the Netherlands after their occupation, as well as Denmark and Norway since April 1940, where control of sea routes, ports and raw materials had strategic and economic value. The stability of rationing in Germany increasingly depended on this external flow. Since 1939, the coupon system sought to guarantee a social minimum, and the regime prioritized maintaining the civilian population at a level of consumption that would avoid a legitimacy crisis. This priority was financed by displacing scarcity to occupied territories. Shipments of food, coal, metals, and industrial products reduced pressure on the German internal market. At the same time, the Reich directed its labor policy to reserve German labor for essential sectors and for the army, filling vacancies with workers brought by coercion from abroad. Forced labor became a central piece of that economy. As military mobilizations increased, Germany needed labor for agriculture, construction, mining, and factories. The solution was to import workers through forced recruitment, deportations, or coercive agreements with occupied administrations. In the West, the regime combined labor quotas and administrative pressure. In the East, coercion was more direct and brutal. Millions of people were moved to work under restrictive conditions, with minimum wages or deductions, surveillance, and penalties. This system allowed production to be sustained within Germany without proportionally increasing the internal social cost of the war, because the human toll was largely distributed over foreigners who did not have equivalent legal protection. With the territorial expansion of 1940 to 1941, the Reich operated as an economy that extracted resources through taxation, requisition, and price control. The occupation costs were, in practice, a form of tribute that financed military presence and freed German budget. The requisitions reduced consumption in occupied countries and kept Germany supplied. The railway machinery, ports, workshops, and mines were integrated into a network that prioritized Germany. The relative prosperity that many German civilians perceived did not come from domestic abundance, but from a hierarchical distribution. First the Reich, then the occupied territories. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa opened a distinct war. The invasion of the Soviet Union mobilized around 3 million German soldiers, with a huge deployment of vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and transportation services. The initial advances were rapid, and millions of Soviet prisoners were captured, in addition to occupying extensive agricultural and industrial areas. In the East, the occupation was linked from the beginning to a logic of extreme extraction. The provisioning of the army, the capture of grains, the appropriation of raw materials, and the use of labor were planned as part of the war effort, while violence accompanied the occupying administration on a scale that surpassed the models of the West. The winter of 1941 halted the advance towards Moscow and marked that the war would not be short. The need to sustain a gigantic front multiplied logistical demands. Each additional kilometre required repaired railways, reconstructed bridges, fuel depots, maintenance workshops, field hospitals, and transportation for replacements. The Wehrmacht lost material at a high rate, immobilized trucks, destroyed tanks, downed aircraft, parts abandoned due to a lack of spare parts. Germany increased military production, but the gap between what was necessary and what was available widened, and the economy became even more oriented towards prioritizing the front. However, This shift was still accompanied by a deliberate effort to maintain German civil stability through controlled rations and operational basic services. Within the Reich, rationing extended to clothing and footwear through point cards, with rules for acquiring new garments and requirements for reuse. Daily life adapted to substitutes, repairs, and queues. The black market existed, but for an important part of the population, it was not yet the only way to obtain food. The administration sought for the system to function reasonably because the memory of previous crises remained present in public discourse. Discipline in consumption and acceptance of restrictions were presented as part of national duty, reinforced by propaganda and social surveillance, but material continuity depended on the extraction in Europe not being interrupted. The occupation apparatus was also linked to genocide through administrative channels. On the 20th of January 1942 at the Wannsee Conference, the bureaucratic implementation of the final solution was coordinated through ministries and offices managing deportations, categories, and competencies. This coordination was practically connected to the confiscation and reassignment of assets. Housing, furniture, clothing, valuable items, and properties were transferred to the state or to structures controlled by it. Deportation was not just a human movement. It involved material transfer, inventories, storage, and redistribution. Thus, the administrative functioning of genocide intertwined with an economy of plunder, which fed resources and supplies in a context of prolonged war. Since 1940, the Allied bombing of Germany existed, but during the first years it had a limited effect on the daily life of most. There were attacks on industrial and port targets, material damage and casualties, in addition to nighttime alarms that forced the use of shelters. However, until 1942, the urban routine remained recognizable in many cities. Work, transportation, schools, leisure under state control, news filtered through propaganda. The war was seen in absences due to recruitment, in letters from the front, in purchasing restrictions, in collection campaigns, and in the substitution of products, more than in permanent mass destruction within German territory. The war also became tangible through the flow of objects from occupied territories. Soldiers and officials sent packages with products that were difficult to obtain in Germany, and the internal market incorporated goods that came from requisition networks. This movement reinforced a practical perception that the war produced material benefits for those who had access to military or administrative channels. It was not a universal luxury, but it was a concrete sign of how the occupation translated into consumption within the Reich. On a larger scale, the same logic sustained rations. Maintaining relatively stable quantities required constant shipments, more control, more coercion, and more foreign labor. The Battle of Stalingrad exposed the limit of that balance. In the summer of 1942, the German offensive towards the Volga sought to control routes and resources of the Soviet South, with Stalingrad as a key objective. The urban fighting dragged on for months, with severe wear and tear. In November of 1942, a Soviet counteroffensive surrounded the 6th German Army and cut supply lines. Hitler forbade retreat and ordered to hold out. The siege meant that survival depended on an insufficient airlift, with fuel, ammunition, and food unable to meet needs. On the 2nd of February in 1943, the remnants of the 6th Army surrendered. Nearly 90,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, and the defeat became impossible to conceal as an incident or withdrawal. Stalingrad was a public signal that the war could be lost. Propaganda tried to frame the catastrophe as a sacrifice, but the military fact was clear. A large force had been destroyed, and the Eastern Front no longer offered quick victories to justify the cost. From that point on, the relative prosperity sustained by occupation became more exposed because it depended on maintaining control over territories, railway lines, and external production, while the consumption of resources on the front increased. When victory stops being credible, the regime changes its tone. It no longer promises a future. It demands endurance. No way out under the ruins. Keep going until the end. On the 18th of February 1943, just 16 days after the surrender in Stalingrad, Joseph Goebbels delivered the speech of total war in Berlin at the Sportpalast. The message no longer promised a quick victory or a near peace. It presented the continuation of the conflict as a national obligation and shifted the weight of the war to the interior of the Reich with a language of absolute mobilization. In the following weeks, the state intensified labor controls, discipline in factories, and surveillance over expressions deemed defeatist. The change was administrative and everyday. More orders, more supervision, more sanctions, less room to discuss decisions, with a police and judicial apparatus that had already been operating since 1933 with extensive powers. In 1943, the war entered civilian life in a more visible way due to the intensification of Allied bombings. The British Royal Air Force conducted nighttime area bombing attacks, and the United States Air Force continued daytime raids aimed at industrial targets, causing extensive damage in residential areas. In July of 1943, Hamburg suffered Operation Gomorrah, a series of attacks that combined explosives and incendiaries, resulting in massive destruction of the urban fabric. Thousands died, hundreds of thousands were left homeless, and the city lost entire neighborhoods in just a few days. The immediate result was a survival logistics operation. Evacuations, reception centers, distribution of water and food, debris removal, reassignment of housing, and constant pressure on the municipal administration to maintain minimum services. From then on, the bombing became a recurring routine in many cities. Alarms forced people to descend to shelters or reinforced basements. Transportation was interrupted, factories halted shifts, hospitals received the injured, firefighters and rescue teams worked amid fires and collapses. The accumulated destruction affected homes, electrical networks, water supplies, bridges, workshops, stations, and archives. Urban life was reorganized around temporary repairs, windows covered with boards, streets blocked, trams with altered routes, schools relocated, offices moved to still usable buildings. The regime tried to maintain continuity with propaganda, but the material landscape of many cities already contradicted any narrative of normality. The evacuation became a permanent policy. Children and women were sent from industrial areas to rural areas or to less exposed cities, and that separation transformed the family and labor structure. In the cities, industrial workers, essential service personnel, and those who could not move were concentrated. In the countryside, municipalities with limited resources had to accommodate the arriving population with few belongings, integrate them into schools, distribute food, and resolve conflicts over space and supplies. The movement of the population was not a unique event, but a succession of transfers, partial returns, and new evacuations, according to the rhythm of attacks and the destruction of housing. As the West suffered increasing bombings, the Eastern Front approached another form of rupture. Since 1944, the Soviet advance accelerated the German retreat and pushed millions to move westward. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, the collapse of transport and military pressure turned that movement into a phenomenon of saturated roads, overcrowded trains, and receiving cities with insufficient capacity. The local administration operated with incomplete records, a lack of housing, and a shortage of heating fuel. The war was no longer just news from the front. It was a human mass in transit, with needs for food, shelter, and healthcare, managed under conditions of administrative breakdown. The internal supply also deteriorated. Between 1943 and 1945, official rations were reduced, the black market expanded, and distribution increasingly relied on local connections and access to products outside the regular circuit. Essential industry workers received, when possible, supplements, but the overall decline in supply affected work capacity, public health, and the functioning of services. The state responded with more controls and penalties, the prosecution of hoarding, sanctions for breaches of rationing cards, monitoring of conversations, campaigns against defeatism. In practice, this hardening reinforced the idea that the exit would not be negotiated or managed flexibly, but imposed through discipline and fear. The industrial effort continued, but under increasingly contradictory conditions. The production of armaments was reorganized with the dispersion of workshops, relocation of lines to underground or remote facilities, and expanded use of forced labor. Under Albert Speer, the Ministry of Armaments promoted a rationalization that achieved production increases during certain periods, even with bombings. However, producing did not equate to availability. The destruction of railway networks, stations and bridges hampered distribution. The lack of fuel limited the movement of vehicles and training. The wear and tear on pilots and the reduction of flight hours affected air effectiveness. The economy could manufacture weapons that were then immobilized due to the absence of transport, spare parts, or gasoline. The system continued to operate, but with increasingly less real coordination between factory, depot, and front. On the 20th of July 1944, the failed assassination attempt against Hitler and the subsequent repression closed one of the last expectations for change from within. The investigation and the arrests affected military and civilian sectors, and the executions became a public signal that any alternative would be punished without limits. The regime took advantage of the episode to reinforce control over the army, expand police powers, and tighten special courts. For the population, the message was twofold. The leadership remained intact, and the possibility of an institutional turn was nullified by exemplary terror. In the same year, the military situation became irreversible. The Allied landing in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 opened a massive front in the west, and in the following months Germany lost territory, resources and maneuverability. In the east, Soviet offensives destroyed army groups and pushed the line towards the borders of the Reich. By the end of 1944, Germany was fighting on several fronts with exhausted reserves, damaged cities, interrupted transport, and an increasingly precarious supply. The state responded with internal mobilization measures, extending working hours, closing activities deemed non-essential, expanded recruitment, and the use of emergency militias. The goal was no longer to conquer, but to delay the collapse. The winter of 1944 to 1945 concentrated the effects of that degradation. The lack of coal, the damage to electrical networks, the break of railways, and the presence of refugees pressured the administration to its limit. In many areas, local authorities acted without clear instructions or with intermittent communications. Hospitals operated with shortages of medications, materials, and personnel, while bombings and nearby fighting increased the demand. The Reich continued to issue orders, but the capacity to execute them was unequal depending on the region, and the difference between central directive and local reality widened. In the spring of 1945, the fighting reached the heart of the state. Berlin was besieged by the Red Army and became the scene of urban warfare with further destruction in a city already battered by years of war. The defense combined remnants of regular units, formations of the SS, improvised militias, and mobilized personnel with limited training. The presence of civilians in basements and shelters, the lack of drinking water in areas, the blockage of streets by debris, and the scarcity of food defined daily life in the besieged capital. Internal discipline was maintained through threats, executions, and punishments for those who attempted to surrender or abandon positions, a mechanism that prolonged the fighting even when the outcome was evident. On the 30th of April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. The event did not change the military situation, but it accelerated a chaotic transition within a state that no longer controlled its territory. In the following days, the surrender of Berlin and the collapse of local fronts advanced quickly, while a provisional government tried to manage the unmanageable: displacements, prisoners, cut-off routes, and cities without stable operational authority. The German capitulation in Europe was formalized on the 8th of May, 1945. With that act, the war ended for Germany as a state, and the territory came under Allied occupation, with an administration that would pass into the hands of military authorities, in a country marked by urban destruction, supply breakdowns, and a displaced population on a large scale.